Okay, class, so in this next part of chapter 6, I'm going to go through the skeletal system and look at all the different bones and things like that. I'm not going to go through each of the slides necessarily here. I want you to look through the slides. Most of this information is just self-explanatory. There's just showing the different bones and things like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the list of bones that you need to know for the quiz. And this is a list of bones. You can find this on Blackboard and on Connect. I encourage you, if you haven't yet, to download it and make sure you start looking through and learning these bones. These are the bones you're going to see on the quiz. Now there's two lists here. There's the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. I do want to talk about that just briefly. So the axial skeleton makes up everything that's shown here in this figure in blue. Okay, so the axial skeleton, axial means it's just kind of going right down the middle here. So our skull, our thoracic cavity, and then our vertebral column, that's the axial skeleton. The appendicular skeleton is everything shown here in normal kind of bone color, I guess, kind of yellowish, whitish. But anyway, so basically our arms and our legs and the girdles that hold them to the axial skeleton, that's the appendicular skeleton. So that's why we have the two lists here. So the first bones here listed are the bones that are found in the skull. So we're gonna pop back over here, and so we're gonna try to do this simultaneously here. So we'll have a picture over here, and then we'll have the bones that we're looking at. Actually, let's leave this here, and then let's have the list of bones over here. So we'll see at the same time, hopefully. Okay, so let's drop down here and let's look at the skull. So there's a number of bones in the skull, and you're going to have to know a number of them for the test. Let's look at this picture here. These are pictures from your books. You can go and look at these in practice and learn all these bones. And this is nice because the skull is multicolored, so you can easily differentiate between the different bones. So the first one is the frontal bone, which is just the very front part of the head. You can see it's a single bone. It covers some of the orbits. Part of the orbits of the eyes are formed by the frontal bone, and here it is in the skull. The parietal bone is better seen from the side. You can see it here in blue. So it's a larger bone. It's actually made up of two bones, one on each side of the head. So we have two parietal bones, one frontal bone, two parietal bones. Now these bones are separated from each other by these sutures. And you're going to need to know these sutures as well. So the one that we see here, we can see the coronal suture, and we can also see the squamosal suture and the lambdoidal suture. You can see those. So the coronal is separating the frontal bone and the parietal bones. The squamous is separating the parietal bone from this bone here, which is the temporal bone, which you also need to know. So there are two temporal bones as well, one on each side of the head. And then we have the lambdoidal suture that is separating the parietal bones from this bone in the back, which is the occipital bone. And you only have one occipital bone. So one frontal bone, one occipital bone, two parietal bones, two temporal bones. And those are the sutures. The only suture that's not shown here, and I guess you don't even need to know it for the quiz, is the sagittal suture, and that separates the two parietal bones from each other. It goes right along the top of the head, but it's not on our list to know for the quiz, so you'll learn it at some point, but you don't need to know it for now. Okay, so those are the bones of the skull, and then we have some facial bones here as well. So we have the mandible. The mandible is the jawbone, and the jawbone is a single bone. Moves across, and it has teeth in the mandible, and then above the mandible is the maxilla. We actually have two maxillae, and they also have teeth. So our teeth are in the mandible and in the maxilla. And if we go up here, you can see the maxilla, how it's separated here in the front by a little suture. So we have two maxillary bones. The zygomatic bone is here on the side. The zygomatic bone is your cheekbone. We have two cheekbones. So zygomatic bone, you can see it here on the side how it forms that cheek area there. And then we have the nasal bone. If we go back to the frontal view here, we can see that there are two nasal bones, and they are the ridge of the nose. So the bottom part of the nose is all made of cartilage, but the top part, the ridge here, is made up of two little nasal bones. There are some other bones here as well, but they are not bones that you are required to know for the quiz. You will see them at some points. I will just point them out, but just realize that you're not going to be tested on them. You have the sphenoid bone that's in the back of the eye, orbit of the eye. You can see there are two of those. And they also show up if we look at the top. So if we were to cut the top of the head off and look down in, we can see the sphenoid bone here. Sorry, there's only one sphenoid bone, but you can see it in, I misspoke there. But anyway, it shows up in each of the orbits of the eye, but we only have one sphenoid bone. It's a continuous bone. Looking down here, we can see this is the frontal bone, parietal bones, temporal bones, occipital bone. Okay, and then also there is the ethmoid bone. You can see the ethmoid bone here on the sides of the nose, also the orbit of the eye. You can see the ethmoid bone better from the side. You can see where it's pointed out there. And even better from this view here, there's the ethmoid bone going up into the skull where the brain is. I should have pointed out the sphenoid bone looks kind of like a butterfly. It's a little butterfly bone in there. And it has the sella turcica, and that's where the pituitary gland sits, right in that little spot there. So we'll see the pituitary gland later in the semester. There's a vomer bone. There's a single vomer bone which forms the septum in between the two nostrils. Okay, so there's that. And the lacrimal bone, which is just on the edge of the nasal cavity and also the orbit there. We have two lacrimal bones, so you can see those there. You can see them a little better here. So here's the lacrimal bone, and behind it is the ethmoid bone. Bones that we can't see from the front or back, the palatine bone forms the hard palate of your mouth. So the front part of your mouth is the maxilla, behind that is the palatine bone. And I think that is about it. The rest of everything that's listed here are structures or features of the bone. So we have a foramen magnum. Remember, foramen is a hole. Magnum means great or large. So the large hole at the base of the skull is the foramen magnum. Here's an occipital condyle. We talked about a condyle, which is an articulation. This is where the skull articulates with the vertebral column. Here's a fossa. Remember fossa. There's a process, styloid process, where muscles attach. What else can we see here? We talked about sutures. We're going to see the external acoustic meatus here. That's another feature of the bone, a hole where our ear canal basically is going in there. Here's another process, coronoid process. So you can just see some of those features there as well in the bone. Okay, so those are those. So that's the skull, the bones of the skull, and then we get into the vertebral column. So let's look at the vertebral column. Okay, so the vertebral column. So we have some separate parts of the vertebral column. We have the cervical vertebrae, which make up the top 7 vertebrae in the vertebral column. We have thoracic vertebrae, which are the next 12. There's 5 lumbar vertebrae. And then we have the sacrum, which is made up of some fused vertebrae. And below that we have the coccyx, which is made up of some fused vertebrae. Sacrum is made up of 5 fused vertebrae. Coccyx is made up of 3 to 5 fused vertebrae, also known as your tailbone. The way that I remember how many vertebrae are in each group is think about the meals that you eat during the day. So in the morning, we eat breakfast at about 7 a.m. So the top vertebrae, we have 7 cervical vertebrae. Lunchtime is at about noon, so we have 12 thoracic vertebrae in the middle. Then in the bottom, we eat dinner around 5 p.m. There's 5 lumbar vertebrae. To kind of remember when how many are in each of those groups there. The very top two vertebrae are special. They are cervical vertebrae, but they have a different name. The first one is called the atlas, and the second vertebrae is called the axis. And these are significant because this is where our head attaches to our vertebral column. Now the very top one is called the atlas, and if you think about, so there's a mythical god named Atlas. Actually, I don't know if he's a god, but anyway, in mythology, there's a guy named Atlas, and his job is to hold up the earth, and that's basically what the atlas vertebrae is doing. Is it's holding up our head. Okay, so it's the very first one, and then the axis is the second one, right below that, and it's special because. Let's see if we can find a. I think I have a picture in here. Here you go. Here's a picture from your book showing the atlas vertebrae and the axis vertebrae. Now the atlas vertebrae, not only does it have where the condyles are articulating, holds up our head, but this is what allows us to shake our head no. Because the axis vertebrae has this little process here, the odontoid process, also called the dens, and that allows the vertebrae, the atlas vertebrae, to rotate around the dens and allows us to shake our head no. The axis vertebrae is what allows us to shake our head yes, so we can move it up and down in that manner. Some other things about the vertebral column, just briefly here. So notice that the spine is curved, and this is important. So the cervical and lumbar are convex, the thoracic and sacral are concave. So if we looked at this, convex means moving towards the front and concave is out. So the cervical has a curve, and then the thoracic has a curve in the opposite direction, lumbar is in the opposite direction, and then the sacrum goes back the other way. So those are the curvatures of the spine. Now, if these curvatures become exaggerated in one way or the other, then that can be a problem. We have lordosis. So you can see lordosis is an extreme convex curvature. Kyphosis is a extreme concave curvature. And then scoliosis is when the spine does not go straight up and down. So those are some problems that can be associated with the curvatures of the spine. Intervertebral discs. In between all the vertebrae, there is cartilage. It is fibrocartilage, and it's there to allow for the movement. So absorb shocks, allows for motion. However, these discs can slip. You've probably heard of a slipped disc or a herniated disc, and that can be very, very painful. But so the fibrocartilage has a job there to help cushion and make things work well. Okay, next we're going to get down into the rib cage, the bones that you need to know for the rib cage. There are 12 sets of ribs, and the rib cage is there to protect our heart and lungs, as we said before. And this is how this is set up. Just a note there, the men and women both have the same number of pairs of ribs, 12 pairs of ribs. Everybody has that. Now there are different categories. We have true ribs, false ribs, and then what we call floating ribs. So let's look at our rib cage here and see the difference here. So the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pairs of ribs are called true ribs. The reason they're called true ribs is because they are directly attached to the sternum. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all directly attached to the sternum. The next 5 sets, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, are called false ribs. Okay, so we have our 7 pairs of true ribs, 5 pairs of false ribs, and then the last 2, 11 and 12, are also called floating ribs. So they are both false ribs and floating ribs because they do not attach to the sternum, but they also do not attach indirectly to the sternum. Pair 8, 9, and 10, they indirectly, with cartilage, attach to the sternum, but 11 and 12 don't even have an attachment, so they are both false and floating ribs. So those are the different ribs that you need to know. Let's look at, before we move on to the appendicular, let's look at the sternum. It's here as well. So the rib cage is attached to the sternum. The sternum is this whole bone here, but it actually has three parts that you need to know. There's the manubrium, which is the top, and it's kind of this almost diamond-shaped part of the sternum. We have the body, which is the long part, and then the xiphoid process, which is down at the bottom, the little pointy part. The xiphoid process, if you ever have to do CPR, that's what they tell you to find. So if you can find your rib cage, and where the rib cage comes together, that's where the xiphoid process is going to be, and then you use that to measure how many fingers up from the xiphoid process, and then that's where you do the compressions for CPR. Alright, so let's now move on to the appendicular skeleton. I'm going to move this over here so we can see the bones that we need to know for the appendicular skeleton. Okay, so first we're going to look at the top, the upper part of the appendicular skeleton. So this is the pectoral girdle. The pectoral girdle, and then our arms. Pectoral girdle, is the shoulder. This is where our arms attach to the axial skeleton. It's made up of the clavicles and the scapulae. So if we look here, this is our pectoral girdle. So we have two clavicles. Those are also known as collarbones. Here's our clavicle. So notice the spelling of clavicle. This is where so on the quiz you're going to have to be able to spell these right. Many students miss clavicle. They'll either spell it with a C-A-L or C-E-L. But notice it's L-E, C-L-E at the end, clavicle at the end. And then the scapula, which is our shoulder blade, and that's back behind our body. And you can see there's a number of different features of the scapula. So the scapula and clavicle together form the pectoral girdle, which our arm then attaches to. Okay, the upper limb, we have the humerus. Notice the spelling here as well. It's just U-S, not O-U-S. Humerus, radius, and ulna. And then we have the hand as well. So when we're looking at let's actually look at the whole arm. So this shows just the humerus, and it shows all the features. So you'll recognize some of these: a tubercle, tuberosity on the side of the bone here. We have a condyle. We have the medial epicondyle and the lateral epicondyle. So that tells you how they are associated with the arm. With the body. So medial is going to be closer to the axis of the body. Lateral is farther away. We have the trochlea, where the radius and ulna are going to attach. We have a tubercle as well. Okay, so here are the radius and the ulna. So the ulna is this longer bone here, and it forms the elbow. The radius is on the outside. So if we're looking at an individual that's in anatomical position, so you can see the humerus up above, and then the radius and ulna. If an individual is in anatomical position, meaning their hands are facing towards you, their thumbs are out, then the ulna is going to be the inner bone, and the radius is going to be on the outside. And so again, the ulna is going to form the elbow. The radius forms most of the articulation with the hand. And you can see all the different features here. We have a process, a couple processes, tuberosity, styloid process, all these different parts here. You can see how the ulna kind of wraps around the humerus, right where the trochlear is. Here's the trochlea, and here's the trochlear notch that forms around the trochlea, and that allows for our movement of our elbow. And then down to the hands, so we have the radius and the ulna, and then we have the wrist bones, which are carpals. We have the metacarpals, which are your palm, and then you have the phalanges, which are the digits of your hand. So the phalanges, there are 3 little bones for each of your fingers that make up the phalanges, and then 2 in your thumb. Now metacarpals, even though here they look like they're extended fingers, this is all covered with skin and tissue, and it forms the palm of your hand. So don't get confused there. So carpals, we have the carpals of the wrist, and there are 8 carpals. You don't need to know all the individual carpals in this class. And then there you have your metacarpals that are 5, and then you have your phalanges 3, 6, 9, 12, 13, 14 in your hand. Okay, so that's the upper part. Then we have the bottom part, the pelvic girdle and the pelvis. Now the pelvic girdle, this is what attaches our legs to our body, and it's made up of the coxal bones, or the hip bones, and then we're going to have our legs. So the coxal bones have 3 parts, and you're going to need to know these parts. So we'll look at this here. So here's our coxal bone. You can see how it attaches to the sacrum, which is part of the axial skeleton. So the 2 coxal bones are attached together by the pubic symphysis. So it's this little bit of cartilage here at the front. And there are 3 parts here. We have the ilium, which is the top part here. Okay, we have the ischium, which is this kind of rounded part down below, and then the pubis, which is where the 2 bones hook together. You can see over here on the right, it shows a picture looking at the coxal bone. So you can see this kind of circular part here is the acetabellum. The acetabellum is where the where the femur articulates with the coxal bone. So the top part is the ilium. The ischium comes down below and makes that rounded edge, and then you have the pubis here at the front. Okay, you can see a number of features here as well. We have a tuberosity here. We have a foramen. That's a big hole in our coxal bone. And there's a spine and a crest as well on the coxal bone. So a few different features there to look at. So there are some differences between the pelvic girdle in males and females. So in female, the ilia are more flared, so they have broader hips. The pelvis is wider. The inlet and outlet of the true pelvis is wider. The pelvic cavity is more shallow, and female bones are lighter and thinner. And then also the female pubic arch is wider. So if you look here, here's the pubic arch, it's wider versus thinner in males, and the more flared ilia of the coxal bones. And this is for childbearing and also for childbirth. So the child has to come down through the birth canal. So there's some slight differences. You can see that in the pelvic girdle. Okay, and then the bones of the limbs. We have the femur, the tibia, the fibula, the patella. Then we'll get into the foot. So the femur is a very big bone in your leg. This is the largest and longest bone, heaviest bone in our body. Very strong bone. Can be broken, difficult, and from what I understand, very, very painful. But here's the femur bone. It has a number of special features. It has a big head and a neck. And then this is the trochanter. Remember, that's only found on the femur. We have some epicondyles and condyles. So remember, a condyle, an epicondyle is a process coming off of the condyle. And then where the patella is going to attach, and then the other parts. We also have a neck here. I think I pointed that out, a head and a neck. So this is the femur bone. Okay, next we have the tibia and fibula. Now this is, as you're preparing for the quiz, make sure that you keep these straight. Students will sometimes mix these up and call one the tibula and the other the fibia, but it's the tibia with a T and a fibula, which is the smaller, thinner bone behind. Tibia is the big bone. This is your shin bone, and then the fibula forms back behind. And they're connected to each other with some cartilage, with some fibrous cartilage in there. Okay, there's also some features here. We have some condyles, a medial, meaning towards the inside of the leg, lateral condyle on the outside. We have some tuberosities. There's a crest here. So those some parts of the tibia and fibula. Oh, one other thing, the patella. I guess it doesn't show it specifically here, but you know the patella is the kneecap, and that's in there as well. So it's a sesamoid bone between the femur and the tibia and fibula. And then the bones of the ankle and feet. So these ankle bones are tarsal bones. And there are 7 of them. They're listed here, but you don't need to memorize them for the tests. The biggest tarsal is called the talus, and that's where our tibia attaches there. The calcaneus is also a large tarsal. That's the ankle bone. And then we have some other smaller bones in here as well. Okay, so the calcaneus, the talus, and then these other little bones. The the metatarsals come after the tarsals. So tarsals, metatarsals, again, these, even though they look like elongated toes here, this is all covered in tissue. The sole of your foot, and so the ball, I guess what we call the ball of our foot, is the metatarsals. And then you have the phalanges. So fingers and toes are both called phalanges. Each of the phalanges is made up of 3 bones except your big toe, which only has 2 bones. So there are 14 phalanges, just like in the fingers. Okay, so 14 phalanges, 5 metatarsals, and then 7 tarsals. And there you go. So that makes up the bones. Those are all the bones that you need to know for the quiz. Really focus on spelling. So you're going to have to recognize these bones and be able to spell them correctly as well. So watch out for some of those things I talked about, the humerus, the clavicle, what are some others? The fibula and tibia and things like that. So good luck, study hard, and you'll do great.